Most people believe danger announces itself. Loud, obvious, easy to avoid. That belief is why so many men never see it coming. The most destructive woman you will ever meet does not look dangerous. She looks fragile, understanding, safe. She speaks softly. She shares pain. She makes you feel chosen. And slowly, without violence or threats, something inside you begins to collapse. You don't lose her first. You lose your certainty, your instincts, your confidence in what you see, feel, and remember. This story is not about hatred. It is not about blaming women. It is about psychology, power, and patterns that repeat with surgical precision. If you've ever felt emotionally exhausted while being told you're not doing enough, if love slowly turned into anxiety, guilt, and self-doubt, if you wondered how you became someone you don't recognize, then listen carefully. Because once you see this clearly, you can never unsee it. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. And if conversations like this matter to you, consider subscribing. Calmly, intentionally. I didn't understand what I was dealing with at first. No one does. We are taught to recognize threats by volume and spectacle. The narcissist, we're told, is loud, arrogant, obsessed with attention, easy to spot, easy to avoid. That assumption nearly cost me my sense of self. The woman I met did not demand attention. She deflected it. She didn't boast. She minimized herself. She didn't dominate conversations. She listened carefully. She remembered details. She mirrored emotions. She appeared deeply empathetic. At first, she felt like relief. She wasn't like the others. She didn't compete. She didn't pressure. She didn't overwhelm. She made space. Or at least, that's what it felt like. Only later did I understand the truth. She wasn't making space for me. She was studying me. A covert narcissist does not enter your life as a conqueror. She enters as a guest, quiet, observant, seemingly grateful to be there. Her power comes from invisibility. She does not assert superiority openly. She implies fragility. And fragility, when paired with intelligence, is disarming. She positioned herself as someone who had been hurt by life, by men, by circumstances beyond her control, not dramatically, not hysterically, calmly, matter of fact, almost apologetically. That is the detail most people miss. Real victims do not need to convince you they are victims. But she did. Subtly, repeatedly, through implication rather than declaration. She spoke about betrayal in past relationships, about being misunderstood, about giving too much to people who took advantage of her. Each story was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. At the time, I didn't see manipulation. I saw depth. I saw someone who had suffered and survived, someone who was careful because she had learned the cost of trust. That narrative activated something in me that runs deep in most men. The instinct to protect, to prove you're different, to be the exception to someone's pain. I didn't feel like I was being pulled in. I felt like I was stepping forward voluntarily. That is how it begins. A covert narcissist never rushes physical intensity first. She accelerates emotional intimacy instead. She asked thoughtful questions. She reflected my answers back to me. She validated my experiences in ways that felt rare. When I spoke about challenges in my life, she didn't interrupt. She didn't redirect the conversation to herself. She made me feel heard. That alone was enough to lower my guard. Looking back, the pace should have alarmed me. But emotional acceleration feels like connection when you don't know the difference. Within weeks, she knew things about me that most people take years to learn, not because I overshared recklessly, because she made it feel safe to do so. That safety was manufactured. What I didn't realize was that while I was revealing myself, she was not doing the same. She was revealing stories, curated pain, selective vulnerability, enough to hook me, not enough to expose her. A covert narcissist understands something fundamental about human psychology. People bond faster through pain than through joy. Shared suffering creates intensity. Intensity masquerades as intimacy. She used that principle flawlessly. Every confession created the illusion of trust. Every tear felt like evidence of authenticity. Every quiet moment felt meaningful. But there was an imbalance I couldn't name yet. Her vulnerability required care. Mine required restraint. She was allowed to be damaged. I was expected to be stable. She was allowed to feel deeply. I was expected to regulate. That asymmetry did not appear abusive. It appeared mature. I told myself, this is what emotional intelligence looks like. Being patient, being understanding, being strong for someone else. The problem is that strength, when unreciprocated, becomes leverage. The covert narcissist does not seek partnership. She seeks positioning. From the beginning, she placed herself just slightly below me. Not equal, not above. Below enough to trigger responsibility. Above enough to maintain control. That positioning creates a subtle psychological contract. You don't notice when you sign it. But once you do, everything changes. The contract says, I am fragile. You are capable. I am wounded. You are responsible. I feel. You manage. I didn't agree to this consciously. No one does. But once accepted, it reshapes the entire relationship. Every time she appeared overwhelmed, I stepped in. Every time she withdrew emotionally, I compensated. Every time she seemed uncertain, I became certain for both of us. And each time she learned something important. She learned how much I would tolerate, how much I would absorb, how far I would bend without breaking. A covert narcissist collects data early, not because she is malicious in a calculated way, but because her psychology requires it. She needs to know where your limits are so she can live just beyond them. At this stage, everything still feels gentle, even caring. Friends would have told me I was lucky. She's so sensitive. She's been through a lot. She just needs patience. And patience is where most men lose themselves. Because patience, when weaponized, becomes endurance. And endurance, when one-sided, becomes erosion. I began to feel invested before I felt chosen. Attached before I felt secure. Responsible before I felt loved. That sequence matters. Healthy relationships move from mutual interest to mutual investment. This one moved from my investment to her comfort. I did not notice the shift until it was already normal. That is the genius of the covert narcissist. She does not push you into a role. She invites you into it. And once you step inside, you mistake the cage for commitment. The first real hook was not attraction. It was vulnerability. Not the slow-earned kind, the sudden kind. She told me things most people guard carefully. Details about her childhood. Moments of abandonment. Betrayals, she said, had changed her permanently. She did this early. So early that it felt flattering rather than alarming. I remember thinking she must trust me. That I was different. That she saw something safe in me. That thought is not accidental. It is the doorway. When someone shares pain quickly, it creates a false shortcut. It bypasses discernment. It feels like intimacy without requiring time. I didn't stop to ask why someone I barely knew was giving me access to her inner world. I assumed depth. I assumed honesty. What I didn't see was strategy. A covert narcissist understands that men are conditioned to respond to vulnerability with protection. When a woman shows pain, most men don't evaluate. They commit. We don't ask whether the disclosure is appropriate. We ask how to help. And the moment you feel responsible for someone's pain, the balance shifts. Her stories were detailed but contained, emotionally charged but controlled. Enough to move me, not enough to expose her. She spoke of past relationships where she had loved too much, men who couldn't handle her sensitivity, situations where she was always misunderstood. Notice the pattern. She was never cruel, never dishonest, never responsible. Circumstances happened to her. People failed her. Life wounded her. There was no overt manipulation in her tone, just consistency. That consistency taught me something dangerous, that I needed to be careful not to become another chapter in her pain. That belief created compliance. When a woman frames herself as fragile, disagreement feels like harm. Boundaries feel like abandonment. Assertiveness feels like cruelty. I started adjusting myself before she asked. I listened more than I spoke. I softened my opinions. I downplayed my needs, not because she demanded it, because I didn't want to hurt her. This is how manufactured vulnerability works. Real vulnerability invites reciprocity. It creates space for both people to be imperfect. Manufactured vulnerability creates hierarchy. One person is wounded, the other becomes responsible. She was allowed complexity. I was expected to be steady. She could unravel. I had to hold. Over time, I noticed that her disclosures never led to resolution. The same wounds resurfaced again and again. The same traumas explained new behaviors. Pain was not something she processed. It was something she used. Each confession came with an unspoken implication. This is why you must be patient. This is why I react the way I do. This is why you can't expect too much. I didn't hear those words directly. I felt them. And feelings are harder to challenge than statements. Soon any discomfort I experienced was reframed. If I felt confused, it was because I didn't understand her trauma. If I felt neglected, it was because I lacked empathy. If I felt overwhelmed, it was because I wasn't strong enough. Her vulnerability became a shield. Nothing could pass through it without being reframed as insensitivity. That is the trap. A covert narcissist does not share pain to connect. She shares pain to control the terms of the relationship. Every wound became a reason. Every story became justification. Every tear became leverage. I didn't realize that while I was learning her history, she was learning my limits. She saw how quickly I softened, how deeply I invested, how easily guilt shaped my behavior. That information mattered, because vulnerability, once revealed, becomes currency. She knew which topics disarmed me, which tones triggered my protective instinct, which emotional cues made me retreat rather than confront. I thought I was being compassionate. I was being conditioned. The most exhausting part was the imbalance. Her pain was always urgent. Mine was always negotiable. When she struggled, everything paused. When I struggled, it was inconvenient. I told myself this was temporary, that once she felt safe, things would even out. They never do. Because manufactured vulnerability is not a phase. It is a foundation, and foundations determine everything built on top of them. I began to feel tired without understanding why. Emotionally vigilant, always monitoring her mood. Not because she was volatile, because I had learned that her emotions carried consequences. A sigh meant I should check in. Silence meant I should apologize. Distance meant I should reassure. None of this was spoken. That's what made it effective. Explicit demands can be challenged. Implicit expectations feel like obligations. I was no longer getting to know her. I was managing her. And management is not love. At some point, I realized I was afraid to disappoint her. Not because she would leave, but because she would collapse. That fear is the clearest indicator that vulnerability has been weaponized. You are no longer relating to an adult. You are stabilizing an emotional structure that depends on you remaining in place. The relationship stopped being mutual before I noticed. It became directional. Energy flowed one way. Understanding flowed one way. Accommodation flowed one way. And I accepted it because it was framed as care. That is the most dangerous part of manufactured vulnerability. It disguises control as connection, obligation as intimacy, exhaustion as devotion. By the time I recognized the imbalance, I was already invested, not in who she was, but in who I believed she needed me to be. Once the foundation was set, the relationship began to change shape. Not abruptly, gradually, quietly, almost politely. What once felt like connection started to feel like responsibility. I didn't notice the exact moment it happened. There's never a clear line where intimacy ends and obligation begins. It blends. At first, I was simply being supportive, listening longer, reassuring more often. That felt normal. Then support became expectation. Reassurance became requirement. And my presence became assumed. I was no longer invited into her emotional world. I was stationed there. When she felt anxious, I was expected to stabilize her. When she felt uncertain, I was expected to decide for both of us. When she felt low, I was expected to lift her. There was no discussion about these roles. They formed naturally because I stepped into them without resistance. A covert narcissist does not assign you duties. She allows you to volunteer until withdrawal feels impossible. At this stage, the imbalance became structural. Her emotional needs were treated as external events. Unpredictable, urgent, unavoidable. Mine were treated as personal shortcomings, inconvenient, manageable, optional. If I needed consistency, I was reminded of her trauma. If I asked for clarity, I was told she needed time. If I expressed frustration, I was accused of pressure. Every normal relational need I had was reframed as emotional incompetence. I began to second-guess myself. Was I being unreasonable? Was I lacking empathy? Was I expecting too much from someone who had been hurt? Those questions never resolved. They multiplied. And confusion is the ideal environment for control. The relationship no longer felt like two people building something together. It felt like I had accepted a position. Unpaid, unlimited hours, no clear expectations, no possibility of completion. I became what I can only describe as an emotional service provider. My role was to absorb instability and output calm, to receive distress and return reassurance, to remain functional while she remained fluid. The more I performed this role, the more permanent it became. She stopped regulating herself. I started doing it for her. And once that happens, she no longer sees you as a partner. She sees you as infrastructure. Infrastructure is not appreciated. It is expected. Any failure becomes a problem. Any fatigue becomes deficiency. I noticed that my emotional state began to matter only insofar as it affected my performance. If I was tired, it was inconvenient. If I was stressed, it was distracting. If I was overwhelmed, it was my responsibility to manage quietly. There was no space for my unraveling, because her unraveling took priority. This is the moment many men lose perspective. From the outside, it still looks like a relationship. From the inside, it feels like containment. I started anticipating her needs before she expressed them. Not because I was intuitive, because I was afraid of the consequences of not doing so. Her disappointment carried weight. My disappointment was dismissed. That asymmetry shaped my behavior. I stopped asking for things that might destabilize her. I delayed conversations that might create tension. I adjusted my tone, timing, and wording carefully. Not out of strategy, out of self-preservation. At this point, love becomes labor. And labor without reciprocity leads to exhaustion. The most insidious part was how reasonable everything sounded. She wasn't demanding. She was struggling. She wasn't controlling. She was overwhelmed. She wasn't dismissing my needs. She was doing the best she could. Those explanations protected her behavior from scrutiny. And I accepted them because challenging them felt cruel. I told myself this is what commitment looks like. Being there when it's hard, not leaving when someone is vulnerable. The problem is that it was always hard. She was always vulnerable, and I was always expected to compensate. I noticed something else that disturbed me. Her stories of trauma never led to growth. They led to exemption. She didn't heal. She justified. Every boundary I tried to set was interpreted as withdrawal. Every attempt at balance was seen as lack of care. I was trapped in a paradox. The more I gave, the more was required. The less I gave, the more guilty I felt. This is not accidental. A covert narcissist structures relationships so that giving feels mandatory and stopping feels immoral. That is not love. It is emotional coercion without visible force. I remember the first time I felt resentful. It surprised me. Resentment felt like betrayal, like proof that I was becoming someone I didn't want to be. Instead of examining the situation, I examined myself. Why was I frustrated? Why couldn't I just be patient? Why did I feel drained? That internalization kept me stuck. I didn't realize that resentment is often clarity trying to surface. The truth was simple, though uncomfortable. I wasn't in a partnership. I was in a caretaking arrangement disguised as intimacy. And caretaking, when not chosen, freely erodes identity. I stopped noticing what I needed. I stopped checking in with myself. I focused outward because that's where the consequences were. Her emotional world became the center of gravity. Mine drifted to the margins. That is how a relationship quietly becomes a job, and how a man slowly disappears inside a role he never agreed to play. Once the roles were established, the next phase did not require escalation. It required refinement. She no longer needed to explain her pain in detail. She only needed to signal it, a shift in tone, a pause that lingered too long, a sigh placed carefully at the end of a sentence. I learned to recognize these signals faster than I realized. Not because I was perceptive, because the cost of missing them was emotional punishment. This is what I now call emotional hostage-taking. Her emotional state became something I felt responsible for maintaining, not occasionally, constantly. She would move from calm to distressed over minor interactions, a delayed response, a misunderstood comment, a neutral expression interpreted as distance. Each time it appeared as if my behavior had caused her emotional collapse. The implication was clear. If I acted differently, she would feel better. That belief is powerful. It creates the illusion that you have enormous influence over someone's well-being. And influence feels like importance. In reality, it was the opposite. Her emotional volatility did not demonstrate my power over her. It demonstrated her power over me. I began to live inside her emotional weather system, constantly adjusting, always alert. When she was happy, I relaxed. When she was upset, everything else disappeared. That is the definition of being held hostage. What made it so effective was that it never looked intentional. She wasn't threatening. She wasn't accusing. She was reacting. Or at least, that's how it appeared. But reactions that consistently benefit one person and burden the other are not random. They are learned. A covert narcissist understands something most men do not articulate clearly. Emotional expression is leverage. Men are conditioned to take women's emotions seriously, to fix what causes distress, to feel guilt when a woman is unhappy. She exploited that conditioning with precision. When she cried, I felt compelled to act. When she withdrew, I felt anxious. When she expressed disappointment, I felt ashamed. Each emotion demanded a response from me, and I gave it, not because she asked, because I had learned that inaction had consequences. The most deceptive part was how small each incident seemed. No single moment felt abusive. No single reaction felt extreme. It was the accumulation that mattered. Over time, I stopped evaluating whether her emotional reactions were proportional. I assumed they were. I stopped asking whether her distress made sense. I focused on alleviating it. That is the pivot point. Once you stop questioning emotional responses and start managing them, control has been established. Her emotions became my priority. Mine became secondary. If she was upset, my mood was irrelevant. If I was upset, it was inconvenient. I learned to suppress my reactions because they complicated her emotional state. Anger became dangerous. Sadness became selfish. Confusion became evidence of insensitivity. So I adapted. I became calmer, quieter, more controlled, not because I had grown emotionally, but because authenticity had become unsafe. This is where many men mistake survival for maturity. They tell themselves they are becoming more patient, more grounded, more evolved. In reality, they are disappearing. The hostage dynamic deepens because it is self-reinforcing. The more you manage her emotions, the less she manages them herself. The less she manages them, the more responsibility falls on you. Eventually, she no longer regulates her internal states at all. She externalizes them. You become the container. Any discomfort she feels must be processed through you. Any anxiety must be absorbed by you. Any insecurity must be neutralized by you. And if you fail even briefly, the emotional consequences return, not as punishment, as collapse. She doesn't say you didn't do enough. She shows you what happens when you don't. Withdrawal, coldness, emotional absence. Those experiences train behavior more effectively than words ever could. I began anticipating her reactions before they happened. Adjusting my behavior preemptively. That is not empathy. That is conditioning. I was no longer responding to who she was. I was responding to what she might feel. And that distinction matters. At this stage, her emotional expressions no longer reflected genuine inner states. They reflected outcomes. If crying led to reassurance, crying continued. If anger led to compliance, anger escalated. If disappointment led to guilt-driven effort, disappointment became frequent. She did not need to consciously plan this. Her psychology learned quickly. What worked was repeated. What didn't faded. I remember feeling a constant low-level anxiety I couldn't explain. Nothing was overtly wrong, yet I was always on edge. That is the signature of emotional hostage-taking. You are never relaxed. You are never fully present. You are always monitoring tone, monitoring timing, monitoring mood. That vigilance is exhausting. And exhaustion weakens resistance. I stopped bringing up concerns because they created emotional backlash. I stopped expressing preferences because they destabilized her. I stopped asserting needs because they triggered guilt. Not because she explicitly forbade these things, but because I had learned their cost. This is why the dynamic is so difficult to explain to outsiders. There are no clear rules, no visible threats, no explicit commands, just consequences. And consequences shape behavior. I began to feel responsible for her happiness in a way that felt absolute. If she was unhappy, I assumed I had failed. That belief kept me trapped, because no one can sustain responsibility for another adult's emotional life without losing their own. The hostage situation works because it feels like love. It feels like devotion, like commitment, like being needed. But being needed is not the same as being valued, and being valued does not require self-erasure. By the time I recognized what was happening, my emotional baseline had shifted. Anxiety felt normal. Tension felt familiar. Relief felt rare. That is not a relationship. That is psychological captivity disguised as care. The emotional control was already in place before reality itself began to bend. That order is important. First, she conditioned my reactions. Then she conditioned my perceptions. This is where the dynamic moved from exhausting to destabilizing. It started subtly, almost innocently. We would remember the same conversation differently. At first, I assumed miscommunication. Memory is imperfect. That seemed reasonable. But her certainty never wavered. She didn't say I remember it another way. She said, "That's not what happened." Flat, calm, unquestioning. When I pushed back gently, she didn't argue. She looked confused, concerned. That expression mattered. It suggested not disagreement, but worry. As if something were wrong with me. Over time, this pattern repeated. She denied saying things I clearly remembered hearing. She claimed she never agreed to things I distinctly recalled. She reframed events in ways that made my reactions appear excessive. Each instance was small, individually dismissible. Together, they formed a system. This is reality distortion, not dramatic lies, not outrageous contradictions, just consistent replacement of your experience with hers. And because she was emotionally fragile, challenging her felt cruel. Because she was calm, doubting her felt irrational. Because she appeared sincere, mistrusting her felt paranoid. That combination is devastating. When your emotional instincts are already suppressed, you rely on cognition. When cognition is undermined, you have nothing left to stand on. I began questioning myself. Did I misunderstand? Did I overreact? Was I reading into things? Those questions feel mature. They feel responsible. But when they are one-sided, they become corrosive. Every disagreement became a test of my mental reliability, not of the facts, of my perception. If I felt hurt, the focus shifted to why I felt that way. If I noticed inconsistency, the issue became my interpretation. If I expressed doubt, it was framed as insecurity. She never needed to prove her version of events. My uncertainty did the work for her. That is the genius of gaslighting. It uses your own rationality against you. Reasonable people consider alternative explanations. Empathetic people give others the benefit of the doubt. Conscientious people assume responsibility for misunderstandings. A covert narcissist exploits all three. I wanted to be fair, so I doubted myself. I wanted to be understanding, so I minimized my reactions. I wanted to be reasonable, so I deferred to her certainty. Slowly, my confidence in my own mind eroded. I stopped trusting my memory. I stopped trusting my emotional signals. I stopped trusting my judgment. And when you can't trust yourself, you become dependent. Dependent on her interpretation, her reassurance, her version of reality. That dependence was not demanded. It emerged naturally from confusion. The invisible cage was not built through restriction. It was built through doubt. I didn't feel controlled. I felt unsure. I remember moments when I would replay conversations in my head, searching for clarity, trying to determine what actually happened. That mental looping became constant. She, meanwhile, remained composed, unbothered, certain. Certainty is powerful when you no longer have it. I began asking her to clarify what she meant, to confirm what was said, to explain why I felt the way I did. That shift mattered. I was no longer asserting reality. I was requesting permission to interpret it. And she granted that permission selectively. When my interpretation aligned with her needs, it was valid. When it didn't, it was flawed. That conditional validation trained my perception. I learned which versions of reality were acceptable. This is why men in these dynamics often report feeling like they are losing their minds. They aren't. Their cognitive functions remain intact. Their confidence in using them has been dismantled. Gaslighting does not make you irrational. It makes you cautious. Cautious about trusting yourself, cautious about speaking up, cautious about drawing conclusions. That caution paralyzes action. I stopped addressing issues directly because I couldn't be sure they were real. I stopped trusting my discomfort because it could be misinterpretation. I stopped confronting patterns because each instance could be misremembered. The cumulative effect was silence. Silence protects the manipulator. She never had to argue aggressively. She never had to defend herself. My self-doubt did the work. What made it worse was her occasional generosity. Moments where she would acknowledge something small, offer a partial apology. Those moments reset hope. They made me think progress was happening. In reality, they reinforced the system. Just enough validation to keep me engaged. Not enough to restore autonomy. Reality distortion also served another purpose. It reframed my emotional reactions as personal flaws. If I felt anxious, I was insecure. If I felt angry, I was overreacting. If I felt sad, I was being dramatic. That framing justified her emotional disregard. She wasn't neglecting my feelings. My feelings were the problem. I began editing myself internally before speaking, not because I was thoughtful, because I was afraid of being wrong. This is how psychological imprisonment works. There are no locked doors, only lost confidence in your ability to leave. I didn't need her permission to exist, but I needed her confirmation to feel sane. And once that happens, the relationship is no longer between two people. It is between one person and the authority they've internalized. By the time reality itself felt unstable, the rules of the relationship had already changed. I just hadn't been told. Love was no longer something that existed. It was something that had to be earned. Continuously, every interaction became a quiet evaluation. Not openly, not cruelly, subtly. A pause after I spoke. A look that suggested disappointment. A shift in tone that told me I had missed something. I began to feel like I was being graded, not on effort alone, on intuition, on anticipation. I was expected to know what she needed without being told. And when I didn't, the failure was mine. This is what I now understand as the performance trap. The relationship stopped being about connection and became about adequacy. I wasn't sharing experiences with her. I was auditioning. Every gesture was measured, every word weighed, every response assessed. And the criteria kept changing. When I became more attentive, she wanted more depth. When I became more present, she wanted more initiative. When I became more supportive, she wanted more emotional intelligence. There was always another standard, always another shortcoming. At first, I believed this was growth, that she was pushing me to be better. Men are especially vulnerable to this framing. We are taught that value comes from improvement, from performance, from becoming more than we were yesterday. She leveraged that instinct perfectly. If I felt inadequate, I tried harder. If I felt distant, I invested more. If I felt uncertain, I adjusted. And occasionally, something extraordinary would happen. She would soften. She would smile the way she did in the beginning. She would be warm, present, almost peaceful. Those moments were rare. And because they were rare, they felt significant. I mistook relief for intimacy. That is how intermittent reinforcement works. When approval is consistent, it is comforting. When it is unpredictable, it becomes addictive. I didn't realize that the scarcity was intentional at the psychological level, not conscious, but necessary. Because satisfaction would have ended her leverage. If she were genuinely content, there would be nothing left for me to chase. So contentment remained just out of reach. Whenever I met one expectation, another appeared. Whenever I corrected one flaw, another was revealed. The goalposts moved silently. And because they moved gradually, I kept following. I began to feel anxious before interactions, not because I feared conflict, because I feared evaluation. Would I say the right thing? Would my tone be right? Would my timing be right? I was no longer relaxed around the person who was supposed to feel safest. That should have been a warning. But anxiety had already been normalized. The performance trap is particularly effective because it mimics purpose. It gives you a mission. Improve, adapt, succeed. It keeps you focused outward, always adjusting, never resting. And while you are busy performing, you stop asking dangerous questions. Questions like, why am I never enough? Why does love feel conditional? Why does effort not lead to stability? Those questions threaten the structure, so the structure keeps you busy. I noticed that she rarely had to perform. Her emotional state was accepted as fact. Her reactions were justified by her history. Her limitations were respected. Mine were not. If I struggled, I was expected to self-correct. If I failed, I was expected to learn. If I needed support, I was expected to need less. The asymmetry became complete. She was the evaluator. I was the subject. She was exempt from scrutiny. I was under constant review. This dynamic corrupts something fundamental in a man. It turns effort into self-erasure. Instead of expressing who you are, you become who you think is required. Instead of speaking honestly, you speak carefully. Instead of acting naturally, you perform competence. Instead of feeling, you manage perception. And the cost is identity. I started losing track of what I actually wanted, what I actually believed, what I actually felt. Those things became secondary to what would maintain approval. That is not love. That is survival behavior. The exhaustion was cumulative. I felt tired even when nothing had happened, because something was always about to happen. When love becomes a test, you can fail, your nervous system never rests. I also noticed a strange contradiction. She often said she valued me, respected me, cared deeply. Yet her behavior communicated the opposite. If she truly valued me, why was I always trying to prove it? If she respected me, why did I feel so small? If she cared, why was my emotional experience irrelevant? That contradiction kept me confused. Words and actions never aligned. And when they don't, people tend to trust words, especially when actions are subtle. That confusion kept me engaged longer than clarity ever would have. I believed that if I just performed well enough, things would stabilize. That belief is the engine of the performance trap. It promises resolution through effort. It delivers exhaustion instead. The man inside this trap often appears functional from the outside. He works, he shows up, he contributes. Inside, he is tense, hypervigilant, afraid of invisible failure. And because the standards are never explicit, failure is always possible. That constant possibility keeps him compliant. Eventually, I realized something unsettling. No amount of improvement would change the structure. Because the structure depended on dissatisfaction, if she were satisfied, she would lose control. And her psychology could not allow that. The performance trap is not about making you better. It is about keeping you engaged. Engaged in proving worth. Engaged in earning approval. Engaged in chasing a finish line that does not exist. And once you see that clearly, the illusion begins to crack. Because love does not require auditions, and respect does not demand exhaustion. Once the performance trap was fully in place, the emotional economy of the relationship revealed itself. Quietly, relentlessly, her emotions carried weight. Mine carried cost. This was not stated. It was enforced through repetition. When she was upset, everything slowed down. Plans paused. Conversations redirected. Attention narrowed to her internal state. When I was upset, the expectation was efficiency. Process it. Manage it. Return functional. Her emotions were events. Mine were inconveniences. This imbalance created what I now understand as an emotional economy. One where her feelings had unlimited value and mine had none. She required constant emotional accommodation. I was expected to provide it without needing any in return. If she felt anxious, I needed to reassure her. If she felt insecure, I needed to validate her. If she felt overwhelmed, I needed to stabilize the environment. But when I felt anxious, I was told to be confident. When I felt insecure, I was told to trust myself. When I felt overwhelmed, I was told to handle it. This was framed as emotional maturity. She was sensitive. I was supposed to be strong. Over time, that framing became internalized. I began to associate my own emotional needs with weakness, with selfishness, with immaturity. That association changed my behavior. I stopped reaching out when I felt low. I stopped expressing frustration. I stopped naming disappointment, not because I didn't feel these things, but because expressing them made things worse. She would either redirect the conversation back to herself, or explain why my feelings were misplaced, or respond in a way that made me regret bringing them up at all. Eventually, silence became safer. This is how emotional self-protection looks from the inside. You don't become numb all at once. You become selective. You learn which feelings are allowed, which are punished, which create distance, and you adjust accordingly. She called this growth. She said I was becoming calmer, more grounded, more emotionally regulated. What I was actually becoming was unavailable. Unavailable to myself, because availability had become a liability. At the same time, something else was happening beneath the surface. She began to question my competence, not directly, never aggressively, through suggestions, corrections, concern. She would offer a better way to handle things I had already handled. She would express doubt about decisions I had made successfully. She would step in to help with tasks I didn't need help with. Each instance was minor, reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern. This is competence assassination. She didn't tell me I was incapable. She implied that she was more capable. She always seemed to know more, to see angles I had missed, to anticipate problems I hadn't considered. At first, I appreciated the input. It felt like partnership. But over time, I noticed a shift. I began seeking her approval for decisions I used to make automatically. I hesitated before acting independently. I second-guessed solutions that once felt obvious, not because I had failed, but because her confidence had replaced mine. She didn't need to undermine me openly. She positioned herself as the standard. If my approach differed from hers, it was questioned. If my judgment conflicted with hers, it was reconsidered. If my instincts diverged from hers, they were treated as risky. Slowly, my competence became conditional. I was capable when I agreed with her, questionable when I didn't. This created psychological dependency. I began deferring not because I lacked ability, but because disagreement felt dangerous. Dangerous emotionally, dangerous relationally. Her reactions taught me that independence had consequences. Disappointment, withdrawal, subtle disapproval. Those consequences trained compliance. I told myself I was being collaborative, that I was valuing her perspective. In reality, I was surrendering mine. This is how autonomy erodes without conflict. There was no moment where she said, "You can't do this." I simply stopped doing it on my own. The emotional economy and competence assassination worked together, because if I could not trust my emotions and could not trust my judgment, then what was left? Only her. Her interpretation, her guidance, her approval. That is not coincidence. A covert narcissist creates dependency not by taking control, but by making independence feel unsafe. I noticed that when I succeeded independently, she was distant. When I struggled, she was engaged. That pattern matters. Support was abundant when it reinforced her role, scarce when it threatened it. Over time, I stopped sharing successes. I minimized achievements. I downplayed confidence, because confidence disrupted the emotional balance. She could not fully celebrate my strength, because my strength diminished her leverage. This is the zero-sum emotional framework at work. In her psychological economy, another person's stability is a threat. So stability must be managed, reduced, neutralized, not consciously, automatically. I began to feel smaller in areas where I used to feel capable, not because I had changed, but because my internal reference point had shifted. I no longer measured myself against reality. I measured myself against her reactions. And her reactions were never fully approving. That ensured the system remained intact. The cost of this dynamic was subtle but severe. I felt less confident, less decisive, less present, not in obvious ways, in quiet ones. Hesitation replaced certainty. Doubt replaced momentum. Permission replaced initiative. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. From the inside, I was slowly disappearing. This is what makes these dynamics so difficult to escape. There is no clear villain, no dramatic abuse, just erosion. Erosion of confidence, erosion of autonomy, erosion of emotional life. And because it happens gradually, you don't notice the loss until you look for yourself and can't quite find him anymore. By the time my confidence had eroded, isolation no longer required effort. It maintained itself. She never told me not to see my friends. She didn't forbid contact with family. There were no rules, no ultimatums. That is what made it effective. Every time I planned to spend time with others, something happened. She felt unwell. She felt anxious. She needed support, not dramatically, just enough. I began canceling plans without being asked. rescheduling visits, delaying calls. At first, I told myself this was temporary, that she just needed reassurance, that once things stabilized, my life would expand again. It didn't, because the isolation was not about time. It was about cost. Spending time with others created emotional consequences: distance, coldness, disappointment. Staying close to her created relief. That equation trains behavior quickly. She also had opinions about the people in my life. Concerns, observations, warnings. She noticed flaws I had overlooked. She questioned motives I hadn't doubted. She framed normal imperfections as evidence of toxicity. She doesn't really support you. He doesn't understand you like I do. They don't have your best interests in mind. None of it sounded irrational. All of it sounded protective. And because my confidence was already weakened, I listened. Maintaining outside relationships began to require effort, explanations, reassurance, damage control. It became easier to withdraw than to manage the emotional fallout. That is how isolation completes itself. You are not locked away. You simply learn that connection comes with consequences. Over time, she became my primary source of validation, my main emotional reference point, the lens through which I interpreted my life. That concentration of influence is dangerous. Because when one person controls meaning, disagreement becomes destabilizing. The guilt followed naturally. She frequently reminded me of what she had sacrificed. Time, energy, emotional labor, not aggressively, casually, in passing comments, in tired sighs, in moments of quiet resentment. At the same time, my contributions faded from view. My efforts were expected. Her efforts were exceptional. This created a psychological ledger where I was always in debt. No matter how much I gave, the balance never shifted. This is the guilt machine. It exploits a man's desire to be fair. If you believe you are taking more than you are giving, you compensate. You try harder. You accept less. And she ensured that belief remained intact. She remembered every favor she had done for me. She forgot every sacrifice I had made. When I expressed fatigue, she reminded me of her pain. When I asked for balance, she reminded me of her effort. The message was consistent. She was always giving more. I was always falling short. That guilt kept me compliant, because leaving someone who has done so much for you feels immoral, even when staying costs you everything. Then there was hope. Hope was the most powerful restraint. Every so often, she would soften completely, be affectionate, present, almost loving. Those moments felt extraordinary, not because they were healthy, but because they were rare. They reminded me of who she seemed to be in the beginning. They suggested that the person I fell for was still there. I held on to that belief tightly. That is hope addiction. When positive experiences are unpredictable, they carry more psychological weight than consistent ones. The relief becomes intoxicating. The contrast becomes addictive. I endured long periods of tension for brief moments of closeness. Those moments kept me invested far longer than logic ever would have. This is trauma bonding. The attachment formed through cycles of distress and relief. Pain followed by comfort. Confusion followed by clarity. The bond feels deep. It feels intense. But intensity is not intimacy. It is conditioning. I told myself that the highs proved the relationship was real, that the connection was worth fighting for. I didn't realize that the highs only existed because of the lows. A healthy relationship does not need suffering to feel meaningful. But this one did. I began to fear leaving, not because I loved her deeply, but because I had become dependent on the relief she provided. The thought of losing those moments felt unbearable. That fear is not love, it is withdrawal. By this stage, my world had narrowed. Friends felt distant, family felt abstract. My sense of self felt fragile. She was the constant, the one person who understood me, the one person whose approval mattered. And because of that, the final transformation occurred. I began prioritizing her emotions automatically, anticipating needs before they were expressed, feeling guilty when I couldn't meet them immediately. Her priorities became mine. My role was no longer questioned, it was internalized. I existed to support, to stabilize, to accommodate. This is the emotional appliance. Always on, always available, never requiring maintenance. My own needs felt foreign, almost inappropriate. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt empty. That emptiness was not depression, it was adaptation. I had learned that having needs created problems, so I stopped noticing them. From the outside, I appeared calm, functional, committed. Inside, I felt hollow. This is the end point of these dynamics. Not explosive collapse, not dramatic confrontation, just quiet disappearance. You don't lose the relationship first, you lose yourself. And when you finally realize that something is wrong, the most frightening thought isn't leaving her. It's not knowing who you are without the role you've been performing. Before you leave, there is one lesson here that matters more than all the psychology. Real danger in life rarely announces itself as danger. It often arrives disguised as meaning, responsibility, and purpose. Many people don't lose themselves because they are weak. They lose themselves because they are loyal, because they care, because they are willing to endure discomfort for the sake of connection. But here is the truth most of us learn too late. Love that requires you to shrink is not love. Care that depends on your self-erasure is not care. And intimacy that costs you your inner stability is not intimacy at all. A healthy relationship does not require you to abandon your instincts. It does not ask you to manage another adult's emotional life. And it does not punish you for having needs, boundaries, or clarity. You are allowed to trust what you feel. You are allowed to name discomfort without apologizing for it. And you are allowed to walk away from dynamics that quietly dismantle you, even if no one else sees the damage. Psychological strength is not hardness. It is sovereignty. The ability to stay grounded in yourself while still caring for others. If this resonated, I'd like to hear from you. What part of this story felt uncomfortably familiar? Leave a comment and share your perspective. You're not alone in this. And if you value conversations that go beneath the surface of relationships, consider subscribing to the channel. Not out of urgency, out of intention, because understanding yourself is not optional. It's how you protect your future.